I first saw Jaws when I was 3 years old, and I fell in love far too young. This has been my favorite movie for decades, but how much of that is me being blinded by emotions? Is Jaws actually a perfect movie? Is it Steven Spielberg's best movie? Well, to figure that out, I'm going to analyze Jaws looking at 3 things it does well, and because I like to torture myself, I'm going to also look at 3 things it doesn't do so well. This is going to be tough, but this is the good and the bad in Jaws. And the first thing I gotta talk about is Jaws is an absolute masterclass in suspense. And that is strength number 1, and it begins right away with this point of view shot of the shark gliding through the ocean, and John Williams' iconic score makes it otherworldly. When we switch to the kids partying on the beach, it's that classic horror trope where people are going about normally, unaware of what is out there just out of sight. And when Chrissy Watkins gets up to go skinny dipping, that sense of dread starts ratcheting up. And the combination of the almost featureless ocean and the lack of any music makes us feel so isolated and alien. Again, classic horror trope. We know something's out there. We just saw a point of view shot with creepy music. Now, where is it? Well, obviously in the water. This movie is Jaws after all. And the POV shots and music kick back in, indicating that Chrissy is not long for this world, that the shark is gonna strike. And it starts very tentatively, but very quickly it becomes utter chaos. This is a great example of brutal violence without actually being graphic. We don't see anything, but you can certainly feel it. But what always gets me with the scene is how short it is. From the moment those first credits popped onto the screen to when Chrissy disappears under the water, it's under 5 minutes. When I was a kid watching this, it felt like about 30 minutes long, and even now, it still feels interminable. And what makes that even more impactful, even 35 years after I first saw it, is you never see the shark. Famously, the mechanical shark had plenty of technical issues, but I suspect that Spielberg wouldn't have intended to show the shark in this first scene anyway. Now, I talked about that scene in a lot of detail, and it is iconic, but really the power of the suspense in Jaws is the sheer variety. Nearly every scene with the shark or hinting at the shark, Spielberg just does something a little bit different with the suspense. Chrissy's death played out like a classic horror scene, with it being nighttime and the suspense coming from waiting to see when she was gonna die. The scene on the beach, though, that plays out very differently. It's like a reverse whodunit. Instead of trying to find a killer, Brody and the audience is trying to figure out who's gonna be a victim.
That doesn't mean we have to serve them up a smorgasbord.
And with a smorgasbord of potential victims, we get plenty of tense red herrings until the shark finally chooses its prey. And whereas Chrissy's death was up close and personal, but you didn't see any blood and you didn't see the shark, Alex's death is mostly from Brody's POV on the beach. It's bloody as hell, and it's made all the more horrifying because this is a kid, and it's actually the first time you see the shark. Then our third horror sequence removes the shark again, and all of the suspense is delivered through this ominous piece of floating wooden debris and John Williams' intensifying score. That's 3 vastly different horror sequences, all building the suspense in a variety of ways. You know what we're missing? Yep, this is an all-timer of a jump scare, and the reason it works is because Jaws showed such restraint with its prior suspense scenes, where it built up suspense in a variety of different ways, that this one feels like it comes out of nowhere. The variance with these suspense scenes is such a strong part of Jaws, and the 4th of July attack switches things up again in several ways. This is the first time the shark's fin is used to signify its presence, and the shark is also way more visible than any time before this in the movie. And the actual horror sequence follows a massive red herring. We have the fake cardboard fin, and then a massive panic from the Amity townsfolk. And only when that clears up does the shark go off and attack the guy in the pond. But I want to focus on something very specific here to highlight the way suspense is handled in Jaws. Because having watched this movie from since I was 3, I kind of have my favorite parts. I know what's going to happen. I know that this is a fake shark attack, so all the setup here with the shots of the crowd, the underwater shots, Brody walking around, Vaughn watching the crowds, that stuff's all going over my head. It feels kind of superfluous because I'm just like, let's get to that guy's leg being bitten off. But let's go back to those underwater shots that I ignored. Pretty unremarkable, right? I mean, there's no music, it's a fake shark attack coming up, so shark's not here, so what's the point of these shots? Well, how did Spielberg use these shots earlier in the movie? They were used as POV shots with music to indicate the shark's presence. Is this a f***ing shark POV shot? What the hell? How did I never think about this until this moment? These are the kinds of nuances that you start overlooking when you watch a movie over and over. It's inconclusive that the shark is actually here, but it's terrifying to consider. And I think that's what Spielberg was going for in using these shots to set up his fake scare. And he keeps playing with the audience's expectations as the movie goes forward. We have this long build-up when Quint hooks what he thinks is a shark, and it all leads to nothing. There's no payoff here. Then the next scene begins, and very quickly we get this.
Down and chum some of this shit.
This is Jaws' second jump scare, and I don't think anyone actually jumps at this moment anymore because everyone has seen this. But the timing here is really interesting because this scene has been going for about a minute when the shark jumps out, and there's really no setup whatsoever, which is completely contradictory to how Spielberg handles all the suspenseful scenes before this. And why is that? Because he used that entire prior scene to set up this jump scare. Magician Steven Spielberg, and he's not done working that magic because the next 30 minutes play out largely like an adventure movie with lots of fast-paced chases, heroic music, and an almost joyous atmosphere.
What were you doing?
This is Jaws at its most fun, and you can excuse these guys for letting loose that night, but we also get this.
Despite all the pounding and the hollering, they all come in, they rip you to pieces.
Well, that's a downer. And this iconic monologue from Quint is placed perfectly here because with all the fun going on around this point in the movie, this is to make sure that the audience remembers the shark is scary. Be very, very afraid of this thing. And it reminds us just how vicious this thing can be, which is what the characters face during the climax. The shark is in full-on horror movie villain mode here. The attack on Hooper in the cage is frenetic and drawn out in a way that nothing has been since Chrissy's death way back at the beginning. This is our first extended look at the shark underwater, and it looks like an unstoppable leviathan. And luckily Hooper survives, but Quint is not so lucky because the shark jumps on the Orca and destroys the boat. Now, the shark does look pretty fake here when it's just laying on the Orca, but this scene continues that frenetic sense of pace with the shark thrashing around, and this is maybe the most violent, visceral death in any PG movie ever. And with Hooper and Quint gone and the Orca sinking, Jaws' tension and suspense is at an all-time high as this feels like Brody's last chance, which makes it all the more satisfying in the end.
Smile, you son of a...
I am amazed with this movie and Spielberg's handle on suspense. Like, every set piece has this great attention to detail and just so much variety. And that craft is also there with the characters in Jaws, primarily our main trio, who are Jaws' second incredible strength. Martin Brody, played by Roy Scheider, is one of the most relatable protagonists I can think of. He's the chief of police and he's new to Amity, which we learned very early on.
Yeah, not too far from the car. How's that?
Like you're from New York.
That line is played off as an amusing character trait, but very soon when Brody is trying to shut down the beaches, he's met with political resistance in the form of implied threats from Mayor Vaughn, and then Vaughn just flat out undermining him publicly.
Are you going to close the beaches?
Yes, we are.
Only 24 hours.
I didn't agree to that.
This is the kind of nuance that just went completely over my head when watching this as a kid. I never noticed the depth to Brody's characterization. He can't catch a break. He's constantly being undermined. He's powerless, and the townsfolk hold him responsible.
Girl got killed here last week. You knew it. You knew there was a shark out there. But still, my boy is dead now.
I love this. Obviously, it's an emotional crisis for Brody, and that's all well and good and dramatically satisfying, but I really appreciate how Jaws frames Brody as a loner repeatedly, whether it's through its camera work or just through its character dynamics. Sure, he's got his family support, like in this lovely scene with his kid Sean, but what are his kids gonna do about the shark? One of them nearly gets eaten, that's what. And Ellen is a great supporting character, but she's gone from the movie at the halfway point. Meanwhile, Hooper is Brody's ally, and they work together to try to convince Mayor Vaughn to do the right thing. But once on the Orca, Brody takes a major backseat to both Quint and Hooper. And I think I forgot to mention, Brody is afraid of the water, and with Hooper being an oceanographer and Quint being a sailor, Brody has to defer to them both repeatedly.
Gotta get to work.
How do we handle this? How do we handle this?
Brody is still the outsider on the Orca, and that is clear during the famous nighttime bonding session between the three men. Hooper and Quint seem to bond easily over their shark encounters, while Brody nervously wonders if an appendectomy is a worthy story. He's so out of his element. I've always interpreted him laughing here as like him forcing the laughter to really try to bond with these guys. He wants to feel like part of the crew. He wants to feel useful. And then later when Quint assigns Brody a task, Brody's really quick to do it like, oh, I gotta show them I can do this, which crushes Hooper's spirits. And that's why the ending of Jaws is so fitting. Brody's been alone all movie long, never quite fitting in with who's around him. He's been likable, he's been fun to root for, but he hasn't really succeeded at much. And so now it's just Brody and his fear of water against this giant, angry, mechanical shark. And when Brody prevails, it feels like a huge pressure release for all of the crap he's had to go through in this movie. Based on how much he's had to put up with in this movie, I'm imagining Brody's wanted to do this for a while, regardless of how insignificant the achievement may have been.
I'm gonna hire Quint to kill the shark. Sign it, Larry.
Brody's not the only character with a maniacal laugh. Hooper has one as well. As a kid, I always thought Hooper and Quint were basically the same age. Like, I thought they were both old men because they both had beards. But Hooper isn't old, he's young, and what I realize now as I've gotten to the point where Richard Dreyfuss in this movie is more than a decade younger than me, is that Hooper's kind of full of himself. He's a shark expert, but he lacks tact in how he interacts with the Amity townsfolk. Rather than just wait to talk to Brody, he just sort of interjects himself and tells these blue-collar fishermen his scientific expert opinion. And it sort of plays into that class conflict, which is a big sticking point between him and Quint.
Counting money all your life.
All right. Hey, I don't need this. I don't need this working class hero crap.
But there's also a lot of bravado to Hooper, youthful overconfidence, and just a general lack of tact. Like, he's extremely supportive of Brody, but he also just sort of takes his dinner? Who does that with a man you just met? And the bravado, I've always wondered how he could possibly say this.
Don't worry, Martin. Nothing's gonna happen.
What do you mean nothing's gonna happen? There's a shark in the water! That's what you think attacked this boat! But now I realize Hooper is young, and young guys especially are stupidly arrogant and overconfident. This is all part of why Jaws is a timeless classic. It's character depth and subtext. Quint is an absolute asshole to Hooper, but we do see that some of it is based on Hooper's lack of humility.
Marlon, Stingray, been through this piano wire. Don't you tell me my business again, Bridge.
That doesn't prove a damn thing.
Proves that you wealthy college boys don't have the education enough to admit when you're wrong.
Hooper's character arc is him learning humility, and he starts to come around upon hearing Quint's story about the Indianapolis, and once he realizes what a dire predicament they are in, and his attitude when getting in the water a second time is a complete 180 from earlier.
I got no spit.
Hooper survives the cage attack, which he doesn't in the book, and he was originally written to die in this scene in the movie. But the actual shark footage where the shark destroyed the cage was so good that they had to use it, but there was no diver in that cage, so they had to rewrite it to make Hooper survive. And I'm glad they did, because in Hooper's last scene, he finally shows that he can admit when he was wrong.
It's Wednesday. It's Tuesday, I think.
Okay, he didn't really admit he was wrong, but Hooper is far more humble at the end of this movie. One character who never quite attains that humility is me. Yes, me, because if you got this far into this video, you're probably enjoying it, so please like and subscribe to my channel. And then we get to Quint, who also is not humble at the end of his character arc. Am I at the end of my character arc? I don't know. But Quint's the other member of the main trio. He's colorful and abrasive, and he's by far Jaws' most entertaining character.
$10,000 for me by myself. For that you get the head, the tail, the whole damn thing.
This is Quint's only speaking scene in the first half of the movie, but he makes quite an impression, and throughout the movie he clearly does things his way, like when Brody tries to radio for help.
Excuse me, Chief.
I don't know if excuse me cuts it, Quint. I mean, Brody was just phoning home. Imagine if Quint did this to other Spielberg protagonists.
E.T. phoned home.
So Quint destroys heartwarming moments left and right because he is traumatized from his experiences after the sinking of the USS Indianapolis.
Very first light, Chief. Sharks come cruising. You know the thing about a shark, he's got lifeless eyes. Black eyes, like a doll's eye.
This is an incredible and iconic monologue as it personifies Quint as someone who's been traumatized by sharks and is weaponizing that trauma into his own personal crusade against sharks. And this makes sense for Quint's character, but unfortunately it's left him without restraint and kind of maniacal in his pursuit of sharks, which is his undoing because he drives the Orca to its death, and that leads to his death. For a movie about masculinity and Quint being such a toxic male, he has a very undignified death. So Quint's character arc is nearly perfect, but the monologue, while I do love it and appreciate how amazing it is, I do think it's a little bit overrated. For one thing, it's really hard to understand what Quint is saying.
Swung in low and he saw his teeth. A young pilot, a lot younger than Mr. Hooper.
And it's also like a scene that I think really works well for fans of cinema and people who love Jaws and really want to get to know Quint even better. But more casual viewers, like my wife, for example, watched Jaws and she fell asleep during Quint's monologue. And even I, as a kid, I always zoned out during the monologue. I couldn't keep track of what was being said, and I had no idea what was going on, to the point that when he mentions...
I bumped into a friend of mine, Herbie Robinson. He'd been bitten in half below the waist.
I'm always like, wait, what? Like, he ran into his friend in a building and his friend was bitten in half? How did that happen? Now that's on me for not quite understanding that he was in the water for like a week and that there were sharks around when he clearly
Swung in low and he saw his teeth.
says all of that earlier. But I do think the monologue's a tiny bit overrated. That doesn't make it a weakness though. The monologue's still great. One part of Quint's arc is Jaws' first weakness. I don't like how the Orca ends up disabled. Rather than it die out from him chasing the shark beyond reason, it happens when he's trying to lead the shark to shallow waters.
Throw him in the shallow water, gonna throw him in and drown him.
He seems very level-headed here, and then like 5 seconds later, he loses his shit with Hooper.
Quint, don't put that much pressure on me.
God damn it! Head up! Get back there! I break the instruments here!
I know, Hooper and Quint, they're always button heads. But to me, this conflict comes out of nowhere because there's been no contentiousness since that monologue. And while this makes sense for the character, I would have much preferred this happen while they were chasing the shark, for that to be Quint's undoing, because that would have felt natural for his character arc. Instead, this feels like a plot device. But you know you're talking about a great movie when that's legitimately the only flaw you can think of. My other two weaknesses for Jaws are going to be utter nitpicks that no one should ever concern themselves with. But I'm going to talk about them anyway. Weakness number 2 is 2 very specific shots. One is this one of the shark swimming near the ocean floor during the cage attack. Now this is a real shark, but I hate how it looks for the movie because it looks nothing like the shark anywhere else in Jaws. People complain that the mechanical shark looks fake, and no, it doesn't look like a real shark, but I do think it has a terrifying screen presence. And the production crew does things like give it all these scars and battle wounds and putting like Quint's flesh in its teeth, and it gives it this movie monster personality. And come on, they still got this thing to jump onto the Orca or to slam through the Orca's cabin. The mechanical shark looks great, and there are some brilliant shots from above where it looks absolutely real. But this real shark looks wrong for the movie. It's too small, it's too fluid, it doesn't look like the same animal. There are other shots of a real shark during the cage attack, but those are from a distance or obscured with shadows, so those work. This shot, though, feels completely out of place. And speaking of out of place shots, let's watch Chrissy Watkins' autopsy.
You're intact. Do not smoke in here. Thank you very much. This is what happens. It indicates the non-frenzied feeding.
Like, this feels like they had this moment that they really wanted in the movie, forgot about it, and then just blatantly shoved it in the middle of a scene without really accounting for how it flows with the dialogue surrounding it. Imagine if they'd forgotten the most iconic line in the movie and had to find a spot for it.
Alex?
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
To be honest, I forgot to talk about that line, so I had to find a spot for it in the video. Worked out very well. Let's awkwardly transition into weakness number 3. When did Chrissy and Alex die? And just a note, this is another one of those weak weaknesses that don't actually impact my enjoyment of the movie because they're not actually problems. But I did a whole lot of investigative journalism, so I really want to talk about it. Chrissy died on July 1st at 11:50 p.m. according to Brody's report. And Brody found the body on July 2nd. And then he went and met with Vaughn. Vaughn told him you can't close the beaches. And then Brody went to the beach with his family. I assume that's the next day, but we'll see. Alex Kintner gets slaughtered, and then we have the town hall meeting, which I again assume is the day after Alex Kintner got slaughtered, which would make it the 4th of July, which is impossible because we know what happens on the 4th of July. And Vaughn is very clear about when the 4th of July is.
Tomorrow's the 4th of July.
Let's go back now. This has to be at least 2 nights after the town hall meeting because we saw those 2 fishermen getting attacked by a dock, and we saw Hooper find Ben Gardner's body. So that would mean that at a minimum, the town hall meeting had to have happened on July 1st. And that's assuming again that Brody talked to Vaughn on that day, then took his family to the beach, and then celebrated that glorious day at the beach by having a town hall meeting immediately afterwards.
I didn't agree to that.
Which means that Alex Kintner died like 6 hours before Chrissy Watkins? Because July 1st was the date that Chrissy Watkins died at 11:50 p.m. What the hell is happening here? But then if we go to the town hall meeting again, right at the start of that scene, you see a sign that says Alex's death was on June 29th. I'm assuming Mrs. Kintner didn't find her son's destroyed raft, process his death within 5 minutes, and immediately put out a bounty on the shark on the same day. So I'm gonna say that the town hall meeting actually happened on June 30th, one day after Alex died on June 29th, according to that sign. So the next day, July 1st, Alex Kintner's mom arrives at the dock in the middle of the day, so several hours before Chrissy Watkins died, and then she says to Brody,
I just found out that a girl got killed here last week.
Last week? What is happening here? I didn't learn anything. This is all a huge waste of time. It took forever to edit that all together. I'm just gonna have to delete it because it was all fluff. Thankfully, that leads into strength number 3, and that is that Jaws is a lean and mean movie. There's no fluff to it at all. It's perfectly paced, every scene feels essential, and the movie doesn't do unnecessary things to meet some external agenda. It stays true to the story and the characters. Like, Ellen Brody is a very minor character who modern movies would probably give like a personality quirk or some sort of a minor subplot or like a comedy moment just to spice her up. But Jaws doesn't do that, she's just normal, and that results in her and Brody's relationship feeling grounded and earnest.
Wanna get drunk and fool around?
I feel like a modern movie would have made a joke out of this, that a middle-aged woman's being sexual. That's so funny. But Jaws isn't doing that. Ellen's just reading Brody and sees that he's down in the dumps, and she's doing what she knows can pick him up, and that's just some light flirtation between a married couple. That's it. Similarly, Jaws doesn't cheaply villainize Mayor Vaughn and subject him to a poetic death. While that could have been satisfying, I much prefer how they made him unlikable while still humanizing him in his final scene after the 4th of July. By staying true to its characters and its themes, and more importantly, staying focused, Spielberg and his writing team ensure that Jaws is coherent, which is a major accomplishment when you consider that the first and second halves of this movie are vastly different from each other, and yet they feel like 2 peas in a pod. And I credit a lot of this to this being Spielberg at a younger age. The movie does have some of his visual techniques and trademarks, like the really long one-shots he does in this movie, but it's lacking some of his storytelling trademarks that he'd become known for later in his career. I love his characters in later movies, but they can get preachy and lack subtlety sometimes.
I made a mistake too. I didn't have enough respect for that power, and it's out now.
I love Jurassic Park, but I feel like it can get a bit obvious with its character development and themes. I much prefer how Jaws handles Quint's arc after he destroys the Orca.
Hooper, what exactly can you do with these things of yours?
With him having screwed them all over, he's finally able to defer to Hooper and ask him for help. That is subtlety. Jaws doesn't bother with frivolities. It's a lean and mean thriller / horror movie. Many of Spielberg's films are more joyous than Jaws, with a great touch of sentimentality, but often they start bordering on schmaltzy, which Jaws avoids. And while it's dark and unfortunately a bit too violent for me to share with my kid at this point in her life, it still is a fun movie. It's not super heavy like some of Spielberg's other classics. This is about as rewatchable as you can get without all the excess baggage, and that's why I do think that Jaws is Steven Spielberg's best work. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with me, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.